the psychology of the midwit. The nature of the midwit. This is a term we've all heard bandied around on Twitter, bandied around on the internet, the midwit. And what I want to try and make sense of is, who is the midwit? What is the midwit? What makes the midwit? What makes certain people that write books with titles such as How to Argue with a Racist? What makes them who they are? What is their psychology? And so what can we expect the nature of the midwit to be? Well, the key aspect of this, as far as I'm concerned, and understanding the midwit and how the midwit thinks, is what my colleague Michael Woodley of Manee has called the cultural mediation hypothesis. There is evidence that the more intelligence is associated with taking the dominant ideology, with taking the dominant way of thinking and adopting that way of thinking. So intelligent people will have a tendency to smell the air, as it were, work out what the dominant way of thinking is, understand that adopting or pretending to adopt that dominant way of thinking will help them socially and help their social chances, and therefore adopt that way of thinking and convince themselves of the veracity of that way of thinking. And they will indeed, because they are intelligent, be able to come up with superficially logical ways of persuading themselves of the veracity of that way of thinking, that are not really logical, of course, but they will seem logical.
It's true, like, political correctness does exist. That was one of the main findings that we found.
What does that mean?
So political correctness, what we found that it was that it's actually represented by two factors. We have PC egalitarians and PC authoritarians. I'm going to detail those out and then kind of explain how it is that this movement has been generated from that. So the central element to PC egalitarians and PC authoritarians is the trait agreeableness or compassion. So that's how well you're able to empathize with someone or ability to feel for them. But something that's important to know about compassion is that it actually evolved from the mother-child pair bond. So a mother's ability to care for their child with altruistic generosity. So that's where compassion evolved from. And it's useful to remember that when we're extrapolating onto the effects that we're seeing in society in general with this whole PC movement. So then the differentiating elements of PC authoritarianism and PC egalitarianism are, for PC authoritarians, they have a very low verbal cognitive ability. And that's a correlation or effect size of about a 0.4, which is quite high. And then after that, they also have high interpersonal disgust sensitivity. So how we measure that, that's one of the items on the scale would be, if I were to shake your hand, would I feel the need to wash my hands immediately afterwards? Could we share a drink? That type of thing. We also found a correlation with the existence of a mood or anxiety disorder either in the person who was filling out the questionnaire or their direct family member. So that was the PC authoritarian factor. So the PC egalitarian factor that we found, that one was predicted by, first and foremost, whether you had attended a seminar or had an experience communicated to you from someone else that highlighted individual differences or made you more sensitive, that was geared at making you more sensitive towards individual differences. So for example, seminars on sexual harassment and things like that. So that was the first predictor of PC egalitarianism.
So if they were a person who regularly attends these seminars,
or who had been told to attend one through,
more likely to be PC. So the more seminars we introduce in universities, the more we increase students that are kind of these PC radicals.
Exactly. Yes. So then the second predictor from that was high verbal cognitive ability, which I'm going to kind of link into the PC authoritarians in a moment. And then finally, there was also higher trait openness. So what those kind of combine to create, along with that higher compassion of these individuals, is when you get the PC authoritarians who are quite distressed, that are saying that they're quite distressed. What you see then is that the PC egalitarians, their compassion makes them able to relate to that, or to want to protect those who are high in distress, because again, that mother-child type of pair bond. And then what you see is, so they want to protect those, and then their ability to speak much more fluently because of their higher verbal cognitive ability.
Can you give me a real life example of a PC egalitarian? Because we all know what the PC police what's a real tangible example of a PC egalitarian?
Liberal.
Women's studies professor.
Women's studies, yeah. It's
an atheism movement, which I was roughly involved with, I wasn't terribly involved with, started to collapse because of wokeness. We didn't call it wokeness then, but basically the Me Too movement, if you will, hit the atheism movement, new atheism movement, probably in two rounds in 2000, 2008 and then again in 2011. And in 2011, it dealt a fatal blow that killed it by 2015. So we were watching this whole accusation of sexism, racism, mostly sexism, and sometimes homophobia being levied against people to leverage institutional power by bands of activists who are somehow working in a somewhat coordinated fashion, and watched it tear that movement apart. That got us interested in what is the difference between sexism and systemic sexism. So you got us looking into the academic literature in these, what we thought was sociology and gender sociology at the time, but we found out it's gender studies, and we started looking deeply into these so-called studies fields, cultural studies, identity studies, African American studies. You pick the studies. And what we saw horrified us, so that led us to writing the now, I guess, famous series of hoax papers through a kind of bumpy ride. That we were working on the new atheism thing, but of course that made us very aware, so this would have been in 2013, 14, and 15, of the fact that that ship was sinking, and that the iceberg that had struck it was ultimately the feminist aspect.
Let me just cut in there very briefly, because you said that before and I wanted to return to it and then I forgot to. You basically said, if I remember correctly, that feminism or social justice more broadly ended the new atheism.
Oh yeah, wrecked it.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I've never thought about that.
Once upon a time, I actually got involved with sort of being on the orbit of the new atheism world in about 2010 and 11. So what happened before is sort of fuzzy history to me that people have related to me. My feeling is that it actually looks a lot like Gamergate in the sense that there was some kind of like blogging platforms that were coming up. One would be free thought blogs, one would have been Patheos. And within those blogging networks, there were certain patterns of behavior. This would have been, the late 2000 aughts. And then in 2011, this sets a backstory that I don't know the details of, but all I know is that there was hostility between these people who were very interested in social justice being a fundamental part of what was going on in the atheism movement, and the people who were more what you might call hardline rationalists. And at the time, certainly I would have said that Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, these kind of luminaries, were going to be in the hardline rationalist category. But of course, because of the ethical implications that they were drawing out of some of the things about fundamentalist religion, they were also dabbling into some of the critical theory type thing that I would now recognize as being a critical theory of religion. So in 2011, something happened. It's been now referred to as Elevator Gate. And this was, in my opinion, the death stroke against the new atheism movement.
In addition, there's an extent to which you would expect intelligent people to literally be able to rationalize other people's minds better, to be able to work out what other people think and what other people desire, and in that sense, to be better at solving social problems. And so again, here you see a way in which this is not something that we would associate with a desire for the truth. Yes, there is a degree to which intelligence is associated with systematizing and a desire for the truth, but you can see something that pushes in another direction, and you would expect this to be true of the midwit. You would expect the midwit to put cooperation and the desire to get on with people ahead of the truth. He would have his desire to solve problems and whatever and systematize and showcase intelligence, but he would also have a competing desire to cooperate and get on with people and be socially aware. And when those things came into conflict, you would expect him to have the intelligence to manipulate his worldview such that it was socially helpful. And that's what, of course, you see with midwit type people.
One of the things that Nietzsche says is, it has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up till now has consisted of, namely the confession of its originator and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. So his claim fundamentally is that no matter what the philosopher thinks he's doing while he's writing philosophy, what he's actually doing is revealing and articulating his being. And then you might say, well, where did that being come from? And the answer to that is, well, partly you could consider it a biological function insofar as that we have value structures that are built into us that are the process, we would say, the process of a very long evolutionary history. But because you're also a cultural phenomena, and because the manner in which you've arranged your values and your desires has been conditioned to the last degree by the process of enculturation that you were subjected to, when you confess in an autobiographical manner and articulate that, what you're also doing is recapitulating the entire structure of your culture. It's in you, and you might say, well, where is it in you? And and what does in you mean? Part of it means is that you act out a pattern of behavior, and that pattern of behavior is like a dance that someone is manifesting to a symphonic score. It's unbelievably complicated, and it has its psychological elements, and some of those are conscious and some of them aren't. Some of them are just implicit and embedded in the way you act and the way you perceive, and what the philosopher is attempting to do is to reveal those to himself and to articulate them so that the entire structure can be analyzed. Accordingly, I do not believe that an impulse to knowledge is the father of philosophy, but that another impulse, here as elsewhere, has only made use of knowledge and mistaken knowledge as an instrument. All right, so let's take that apart. Accordingly, I do not believe that an impulse to knowledge is the father of philosophy. So one of the claims, I suppose this would be an Enlightenment claim, is that people do have a drive to knowledge, and that drive is in fact what underlies the production of such things as philosophy. But Nietzsche questions that because he's trying to bring us back to consideration of the fact that you can't separate the philosopher's mind from the philosopher's being. He's first and foremost a living creature, and he's up to something. And the question is, what is it that he's up to? And so you can see the earliest manifestations in a paragraph like this of what later developed into deconstructionist thought. And that was mostly French continental philosophers who pursued that particular line of reasoning. And it is derived exactly from this kind of statement by Nietzsche. So, for example, someone like Derrida would say, it doesn't matter what the content of the text is. What matters is that the text can be used as a tool for power. And that whether the person who wrote the text knew it or not, that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in a way to privilege themselves above other people. And that's really, I would say, the fundamental deconstructionist claim. And it's a powerful claim. It's an utterly corrupt claim, but it's a really powerful claim, and it's related directly to the sorts of things that Nietzsche was referring to in this paragraph. What is it that the person's truly up to? Now, the problem with the deconstructionist claim is that it's an open invitation to cynicism, to thoughtless cynicism. I can just make the presupposition that whatever it is that you're telling me, you're telling me merely to dominate, regardless of what it is that you claim to be doing. Well, the problem with that approach is that it's predicated on the implicit assumption that the only value that people actually have is the desire to dominate.
The third issue is the issue of the so-called blind spot. Now, people who are reasonably intelligent will talk about bias. They will think it's awfully profound to be able to say that some people are biased and some people are not biased. Some people have motivations for what they're doing and they can't be trusted and whatever. They will think it's awfully profound to be cynical and skeptical. But in fact, it's been shown that people that are intelligent are themselves have a very specific kind of bias, which is that they perceive bias in other people, but they don't perceive themselves to be biased. So they have a blind spot when it comes to their own bias. They think other people are biased, they'll think I'm biased, but they won't believe themselves to be biased. Now, why is that? Well, if you adopt a belief, so if you, following the cultural mediation hypothesis, if you adopt the dominant worldview as your worldview, and you attempt to attain and play for social status by advocating that view, the cat is getting very, very frustrated here, just a moment, by advocating that worldview and so on, then you will be more convincing in your ability to advocate that worldview if you genuinely believe it. I.e., if you cannot be aware of your own bias, if you really, really believe it. And so there would be benefits to getting on in life. There would be benefits to under harsh conditions. There would be benefits to having this bias blind spot, to not perceiving yourself as biased, and thus being highly fervent in your advocacy of this dominant set of values. And so you can see how we would be under selection for intelligence, yes, but we would also be under selection for that. And again, the two things would go together, and consequently we would expect this certainty of one's own lack of bias, as it were, to manifest among more intelligent people. And again, we wouldn't necessarily expect this at the extreme of intelligence. We wouldn't expect this at the right tail. Outlier intelligence, things are going to be different. But overall, and therefore when it comes to the midwit, therefore when it comes to the person with an IQ of 120 or something like that, basically the reasonably successful person, the reasonably intelligent person, you would expect this. And this is what we can see. Now, another issue that you would is associated with intelligence is having an analytical attitude, or what you might say is a questioning attitude. Well, this is quite interesting in terms of as a rule, people that are highly intelligent will tend to question things and have a sort of questioning disposition. And so what you might expect is a person who is not particularly is merely quite intelligent to take something that's adaptive and take it too far. So remember, the person that is extremely good at solving problems, the person that's mega good at solving problems, the person that's brilliant at solving problems, is the person with the massively high IQ. Now that person will be questioning, he will be analytical, he will be skeptical and whatever, but he will only do so in a way that permits him to ultimately solve the problem. So you would expect him, yes, he's going to be questioning and skeptical, but only within certain boundaries that permit him to solve the problem. You would expect people who are the midwits, who are less intelligent, to be less good at solving problems. And one way this might manifest is by taking things which would be associated with intelligence and taking them too in the sense that they might help to solve a problem, and taking them too far, such that they no longer help you to solve the problem, and they in fact mean that you can't solve the problem at all. An example of that would be being of a questioning disposition. To a certain extent, being of a questioning disposition and always asking, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by race? What do we mean by history? Define our terms. What is this? What is that? Can we be sure of this? Can we be sure of that? Does help you to solve problems. Taken too far, you end up in a situation where you can't solve problems at all, because the way that we solve problems is by breaking up the world into manageable chunks that permit correct predictions to be made, and from doing so, solving the problems. If you go too far in your questioning, you can't do that, and you are simply less good at solving the problem. And so that's why I suspect that it may be that you have this questioning dimension that's associated with the midwit. That at the moment, that it's going to be the midwit that's always going to be saying things like, "Oh, well, what do we mean by race? What do we mean by intelligence? What do we mean by meaning?"
And so what had happened was there was a conference in Ireland. Nice hotel, the whole thing. I don't know the details with tremendous clarity, but a woman named Rebecca Watson was on a panel, if I'm not mistaken, had spoken in that context. And near the end of that evening, of course, at all conferences, it goes into party time and everything. So late in the evening, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, something very late in the evening, she goes back to go to her room, ends up in the elevator in this, of course, very nice hotel. Not exactly a dangerous place, at a conference of atheism in Ireland. So we're not talking like she's in, like Darfur or some crazy place. And it's she and a young man, and he says, "I really like your talk," something to this effect. "Wonder if I could take you to coffee at some point." She says no. The elevator gets to her floor. She gets off the elevator. He does not go with, or maybe it's the other way around. Got to his floor, he got off. End of story. One or the other. Nothing else happened. And except that Rebecca Watson was then shook by this, and in the ensuing days released a video where she talked to her own camera in what they call the vlog style about how you shouldn't do that because it makes women uncomfortable. They were trapped in an elevator. This is the kind of thing that keeps women out of atheism, blah, blah, blah. Then I think 10 or 15 minute, like kind of little scoldy feminist rant because she got asked out in an elevator after she gave a talk at a conference in a very nice hotel in not a third world country by somebody who did not pursue anything further. And this got somehow the attention of Richard Dawkins, who at the time, of course, was the luminary. And so Richard wrote this very scathing satire titled Dear Muslima to the young Muslim girl about how her problems don't matter. The abuses against what would be a legitimate liberal feminism in Islam don't matter because we have poor Rebecca Watson getting asked to coffee in an elevator in a nice hotel, blah, blah, blah. Very sarcastic, very Richard Dawkins. And of course, once Richard Dawkins decided to pour fire or pour flame on this, the whole thing ignited. And all of a sudden, the issue of feminism and women in atheism became paramount. And so everybody started getting accused of being a sexist. It's the same pattern we see play out all over the world right now in literally everything. People start being accused of being sexists. You see people that are organizing conferences being told that if they invite the wrong people, their conference is going to be accused of misogyny, being exclusionary to women. If they don't put enough women on panels, don't give enough women speaking gigs, if they even have people like Richard Dawkins come speak, that's going to be a problem. And they'll boycott the conference. Maybe they'll call a bomb squad and say that, or a bomb threat in, or shut it down and be disruptive. The whole style of activism that we've now become familiar with was playing out throughout this. And my view, watching this, as somebody who had hoped to be participatory in the movement to a greater degree than I was great disappointment, because the doors of opportunity were closing. It was very clear that the number of conferences was going from a lot and growing to very few, and nobody wanting to have them, and nobody wanting to go to them. I talked to people who were in the atheism movement who had been big players in it, and they started taking essentially something like their children or their spouse or something like as a chaperone to avoid getting accused of sexual misconduct behind closed doors, where maybe nothing happened, it's totally fabricated, all the way down to something being misinterpreted. And this, of course, this is a chilling environment, and so the conferences weren't making money. They weren't drawing headliners anymore. All of the normal things that happen the dominoes started to fall, and eventually you can't have a movement if there's no energy and money making the thing continue. And so the center dropped out. So you had the people who were atheism hardcores, one side or the other, who were still involved, but everybody less interested than that. You know, this isn't what I'm here for. I'm not interested in going to a squabble fest. I don't want to go listen to 10 feminist panels. I wanted to listen to Sam Harris or whoever it happens to be. And he got disinvited, or I don't think Sam Harris ever actually got disinvited. Richard did. Richard Dawkins did get disinvited, and it's probable that that stress of that is what led to his stroke.
Inherently, people that are extremely intelligent are going to make connections between different things, and they're going to therefore develop theories about areas that they have not been directly trained in. But a person who is a midwit, he's not like that. He's not capable of thinking in an original way. Thinking in an original way involves taking different strands of information and bringing them together into a model. They can't do that, a person of midwit intelligence. All they can do is be trained in something, learn information, and sort of add a bit on the end. They're incrementalists. That's how they think. They can't think in the kind of creative way. They've never had an original thought in their life. They can't think in a creative way. And so this leaves them very skeptical of people that do think in creative ways. And that's the thing. People that are genuinely intelligent, genuinely highly intelligent people will make innovations outside of their area of training by their very nature. They will do that. And so you will find that the midwit is very skeptical of this kind of thing, because the midwit doesn't have the intelligence to be able to do that himself. He can't comprehend that it's possible. Now, then we have, this is the nature of the midwit. This is who the midwit is. So he's a person who is reasonably intelligent, but he's not that intelligent, and this leaves him open to all of these problems, which mean that he is good at solving problems up to an extent. I mean that he is good at pursuing the truth, but only up to an extent. He is limited in his abilities to pursue the truth and to solve problems, and he is in a highly predictable way. Now, imagine what would happen if you got people like that, if you got people that were deficient in thinking in that way, and who are highly credentialist as well, whose view was that science is not to do with the pursuit of truth, it's a guild that you join, whereby you are given this magic qualification, this holy seventh seal, and therefore you're a scientist. If your worldview is that simplistic, that if a person has a qualification, therefore they should be listened to. Imagine if you got those people and you gave them a qualification which, in the view of society, rendered them a scientist, rendered them an academic. Imagine if you created a situation where people like that had doctorates. And that's what we've done. by creating this heavily overeducated society over the last 50 or 60 years, in which we go from 5% of the population or whatever in the 50s having a BA to 50% of the population, and therefore we have to increase in order to compete. You get more and more people that have master's degrees and more and more people that have doctorates, and having a doctorate was seen, but is still seen, wrongly of course, but is still seen as a sign that you are part of the intellectual elite. So imagine if the IQ of a person that had a doctorate reduced due to the spread of the doctorate from 135, 130 all the way down to 120, 115. Imagine the consequences of that. Imagine, in other words, if a doctorate became something that was associated with being a midwit. Well, then, of course, the midwits would see themselves as they would no longer have the kind of humility that might be associated with being uneducated. They would regard themselves as having full access to knowledge, as being educated, as being part of the elite, as being authorities, as being worth listening to, as being able to become academics and whatever. Imagine if you did that. And so the consequence is that you would see the rise of the midwit. And once this happened, the midwit would start to push the genuinely intelligent person, the genius, the genuinely really intelligent person, out of the university. Because when it comes to getting jobs, they're both going to have PhDs, but the midwit is going to be more socially skilled. The midwit is going to be more conformist. The midwit is going to be more socially liberal. The midwit is going to be higher in altruism. The midwit is going to be lower in autistic traits. The midwit is going to be more cooperative. The midwit is going to be more sort of fervent and therefore inspiring, and you'll have this feeling that he's certain and confident, and therefore you're going to want to work with the midwit, and therefore the midwit is going to be employed by the universities, and the midwit is going to employ other midwits and other midwits and other midwits, and eventually you will get to a point where empathy becomes more important than the pursuit of truth, where conformity to the current social dogma becomes the key issue in order to get a job at a university, where liberal views become the key issue to getting a job at a university, and so on. And eventually you'll get a situation where the whole university system gets taken over by midwits, and the people who originally were part of that system and who came up with brilliant original ideas are slowly pushed out of that system because they can't cope with the stupidity of the midwits. They can't deal with these people. They can't deal with their dogmas and their speech codes and their prizing of things above truth and whatever, and so they're driven out. And that is what the expansion of the PhD into midwit territory has done. Because remember, the midwit does not see science as being about the pursuit of truth. The midwit is the kind of person who will say, hey, guys, I'm a scientist. The midwit is the kind of person that will stress their academic qualifications because they're a scientist. The midwit is the kind of person who sees everything not in terms of the pursuit of truth, but in terms of the pursuit of social status, in terms of the pursuit of power, in terms of the pursuit of certain goals that they like, such as cooperation and kindness and whatever, but not in terms of the pursuit of truth. And so if you have the expansion of higher education and the expansion of the doctorate such that where the doctorate remains the gold standard of being an elite academic, the gold standard of being a person who is worth taking seriously, then those people will regard themselves as being worth taking seriously. Those people will lack the bias blind spot. They will see themselves as being worth taking seriously. They will see themselves as the new elite, and they will remove genuinely intelligent people, and you will perhaps, I think you're seeing it, start to see the decline of the university. So that is the psychology of the midwit, and that is why the midwit is taking over. The midwit is taking over because the midwit primarily is concerned with credentials and qualifications. We have seen the expansion of the PhD as the marker of the qualification you need in order to be an academic. The midwit takes up the PhD. The PhD's validity as a marker of being super intelligent is undermined. And once the midwit starts expanding into the territory of academia, then the midwit, because he's more socially skilled and whatever, can take over academia. And that's what we have seen, the rise of the midwit. Now, how do we identify a midwit? Well, as I say, I think a key issue is if a person is a scientist, are they socially conformist? Do they espouse the dominant set of values, which is left-wing values? Do they tend to espouse the dominant set of values and add a bit on the end in order to showcase their not just their conformity, but their originality? Do they go on about and emphasise the fact that they have academic qualifications? Do they use fallacies such as the credentialism fallacy, that you shouldn't listen to a person unless they have a specific qualification in the area in which they're talking about? Do they engage in the Dunning-Kruger? Do they say that someone someone's not as intelligent as they think they are? It's called Dunning-Kruger, this idea that you get people that aren't as intelligent as they think they are. Now, an intelligent person, of course, a really intelligent person, wouldn't accuse another person of suffering from Dunning-Kruger, because they would know that it hasn't been replicated that well, and therefore they'd be sceptical of it. But a person that was less intelligent wouldn't do that. So do they use insults like that? These are the midwits. The midwits are everywhere. The midwits are running academia. The midwits will comment on this video using fallacious arguments. And we will only move science back to the pursuit of the truth if we stop the midwits from working at universities, if we stop the midwits from having any qualification beyond perhaps a bachelor's degree, and if we move back to a situation where the midwit is not part of higher education. And this expansion of the midwit has happened in my lifetime. It's happened in the 20 years ago when I was at university. The midwit was on the rise, but still a lot of academics, even in my theology department, were highly intelligent people born in the 30s and 40s. But since then, you've seen the rise of the midwit, the rise of social skill of the midwit getting you a job, and it is the midwit that is going to cause such serious problems in terms of science. We must fight the midwit. Well, I hope this is a bit of interest, and if it has, then you can see ways to help the channel, which you can see below. And remember, I live stream on Mondays and Thursdays at 7 PM UK time, and I put up a video once every week or 2 weeks. And I will see you soon, and goodbye!